Welcome back, and today we're talking to Michael Ventura about Robert Bly and poetry. And we're going to start talking about how Michael Ventura got interested with poetry and how Robert Bly fits into that. So, why don't you start telling us how you got into poetry and who interested you in poetry?
Well, as I started thinking about it, it was strange because I was about 7, and there was a little book around the apartment. By this time, my brothers and my little brothers, Vinny and Albert, were 5 years younger and twins, and my sister, so I was about 8, going on 8, who was 2 years younger than me. They'd been born, and so of course nobody had any time for me. These hyperactive twins and an infant, and the great part about that meant I could do whatever I wanted as long as I didn't make noise or cause trouble. I could go in and out. I could, as long as I was occupying myself and staying out of everybody else's hair, I was fine. And as far as the grown-ups were concerned, because it was a different time, and life was about the grown-ups, not about the kids. And the kids were supposed to adapt to the grown-ups, not the other way around. And so we're talking about 1953-ish. And for some reason, there was a book. I say for some reason because by this time, my parents were very secretive about their radical politics. They were communists. My mother was much more devout in this than my father, but they were communists. And the McCarthy era was getting in gear, and it wasn't safe to talk about their beliefs and activities, especially in New York City, where all of this stuff was being reported practically daily. It was impossible not to know about it, and if you read the papers. And so in any case, I was left to my own devices. And by this time I could read, of course, and I thought it was a poem. It was verse, because it was the lyrics to a song. And the first verse was, "I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Said I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died," said he. And it goes on something like, "The copper bosses shot you, Joe, and threw you into mine. Takes more than guns to kill a man. I never died." And that just really blew my mind. I remember my very young mind being totally, "Who's Joe Hill, and why did the copper bosses kill him? And what's he mean he never died and takes more than guns to kill a man?" And I won't say that, was the beginning of my poetry or my intellectual life, but it made an impact. It did. And as I started to read, I was reading history books. I was reading history books written for high school kids, but I had, by the time I was in 4th grade, 5th grade, I was reading at high school level. And that's why they kept passing me on the grades, because my reading scores were off the mark, off the charts. My math was totally, never got past long division, literally, but they kept promoting me anyway, giving me D's. You could get promoted with a D. And because in those days you got left back. You did a great overview. And one thing led to another, and I'm in Waterville, Maine, as a foster kid, and I find Howl and Other Poems. And the Ginsberg poem, Howl, truly blew my mind. It was about people going insane. There's a lot of insanity in my family. It was about something I just have experience of. It was about New York City and people running through the streets and things I recognized. It was about sensitive minds in a society that was becoming more and more mechanized. And just a flash forward, some years later, toward the end of the 60s, I was asked to read poetry, a selection of anything I wanted, to mental patients in a halfway house in Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan. And I read Howl. I read several poems to them, but then I read Howl, and they were electrified by how these were not literate people in the sense of people who read. These were working class crazy people who, and I say all that in quotes, but not college educated. These are people with some big problems. And
can I ask you? Can I ask you around that? How did you come to be in that position where you're reading poetry to them?
A friend of mine, actually the sister of my first love. My first love, her name, she passed a few years ago. Her name was Antonia Citron, Tony. And her sister, who's also gone, was named Donata, her big sister. And they were half Sicilian, half Irish. And and Donata was working as a social worker in this place. And she said, and I was working as I've said before, as a typesetter. And Antonia was working, as a saleswoman. And Donata said, Michael, why don't you come down and read poetry to these people? I said, sure. And so that's how it happened.
Okay.
And so these people were electrified by the poem. It was, and they started talking about, this was my experience, and this was my experience. This guy knows what's happening. And I was really blown away by how vivid Ginsberg's poem was to them. And I used to go to the Museum of Modern Art, the very first edition of the Museum of Modern Art. It's all big and fancy now, but it was a modest, nice little Museum of Modern Art between 5th Avenue and 6th Avenue in the 50s, I think. The streets, not the years. And something like West 50-something Street. And had a nice little cafeteria. It was a working class kind of place. And one day I was having my lunch hour because I worked as a typesetter around the corner and up the block. And in walks Allen Ginsberg. And he sat down with his lunch. People were kind of ignoring him. And I went, I got to tell him something. I said, I hope I'm not bothering you. And he said, it's okay so long as you don't bother me. And I sat down and I told him what I just told you. And then got up and left him alone. But I got to tell it to him. And so Howell made a huge impression on me. And in fact, the first poem that I intentionally wrote as a poem, I was about 15, and I called it Ventura Howls. And I know I was consciously imitating and poetry, except for Ginsberg, and this is where Ginsberg, in that particular poem, because he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and most of it was very repetitive, but that particular poem is one of the poems of the 20th century, and not just in English, and reached through all the barriers. And I saw that poetry could do that. And so that got me, instead of writing in paragraphs, which I'd been doing on my own, writing a lot of, like, something had happened and I'd write a paragraph about it. And usually it was just about a paragraph long, a long paragraph, a notebook page. And I got pretty good with that form. And then I say pretty good in the sense of, with the help of some good teachers, I got to know how to construct a paragraph in various ways. And I don't have names for these ways, but I got to know how to how to shape a paragraph in different ways for what I was trying to say. The rhythms of the words, transitions. There aren't really technical words for this. And if there are, I don't know them. But I'd gotten to a place where I felt good about paragraphs. And then Ginsberg's Powell opened me to poetry, that I could do this. I wanted to do this. And at the same time, most of the beat poetry, in the New American Poetry anthology, which I think came out in 1960, in retrospect, I tried to reread it about 6-7 years ago. Most of it stank. Most of it really isn't very good. And I liked Kerouac's novels, the poems. Every once in a while, phrases jump out at you, but basically, and Gregory Corso and Lawrence Ferlinghetti could be funny, and it's hard to be funny on the page. I respect that. But basically, most of it was very young, very adolescent, and that was into their 40s and 50s and 60s. But that was my introduction to poetry. And there were American poets coming out of the time that I liked. I liked Robert Bowles' first book a lot. That was published in the 40s. I liked Anne Sexton's work. She was very open about being very crazy and suicidal. And while that wasn't my thing, I think her closeness to death, her sense of closeness to death, made for that very lively imagery she used. I loved her imagery. But the English language American poets, in general, I was looking for something else. They weren't speaking to me. For one thing, I was working class, but it wasn't just that. And there was something very tame in the American poetry that I was reading in the 1960s. And what I started getting interested in were poets from other places translated into English. Greek poets, George Seferis and Constantine Cavafy and Yannis Ristos, they got to me. Rilke, Miriam Rilke, the C.H. McIntyre translations, got to me. One American poet got to me who had been dead by that time about 30 years, Hart Crane.
Yeah.
And I loved his poems. I didn't understand them, but they had a music to them that thrilled me. And I should back that up with reading hold the phone. But hold on a second. Here I am. And Crane was a lonely, kind of crazy guy from the Midwest, come to New York. A homosexual, and it was very hard and dangerous to be a homosexual. And I had a short, lonely life. Committed suicide when he was probably about 30. And let's see, I'm looking here. Hold on just a sec. And a negative just came out of this book, a photographic negative.
Uh-oh.
I'll say. And I can barely make it out. I'll have to give that further attention somewhere down the line. But, sorry to hold you up.
No, it's all right.
Well, I'm not having a great deal of luck doing this. So, I'm almost there. Okay. This is the way we generally do radio. This poem to Brooklyn Bridge, because it changed my life. I didn't know there was a Brooklyn Bridge.
Really?
You can live in New York City, and it's just too big to know.
Yeah.
And I'm living in the depths of Brooklyn. I don't have any reason to go to that place in Brooklyn Heights, it's called, where Brooklyn Bridge goes into Lower Manhattan. And the skyline that's in the photographs, there wasn't much, there was much fewer outlets to see things. So it wasn't a familiar sight, the Brooklyn Bridge, unless you were there. And living in Queens, living in the Bronx, living in Brooklyn, I didn't know about it. And then I'm reading Hart Crane, and he has his great sequential poem, The Bridge, and it starts with a poem to Brooklyn Bridge. And me and my friend Peggy Flanagan go, we got to go to the Brooklyn Bridge for Hart Crane. So, in this sense, poetry started to show me my city, parts of it that I hadn't known in ways I hadn't known of it. So, and I'll read his poem to Brooklyn Bridge. It's not very long, and you'll see, hopefully, what I mean by the music of it, and how understanding it wasn't really the point. How many dawns chill from his rippling rest, the seagull's wings shall dip and pivot him, shading white rings of tumult, building high over the chained bay waters, liberty. Then, with inviolate curve, forsake our eyes as apparitional as sails that cross some page of figures to be filed away. Now, I understood that, page of figures to be filed away. That was work that people did till elevators drop us from our day. Elevators in a poem. that was new to me. The poems we studied in high school didn't have elevators. I think of cinemas. Again, he's writing about something that's in my life. Panoramic slights with multitudes bent towards some flashing scene, never disclosed but hastened to again, foretold to other eyes on the same screen. Well, I knew kind of where he was talking about, if not what he was talking about. And he means the bridge, across the harbor, silver-paced, as though the sun took step of thee, yet left some motion ever unspent in thy stride, implicitly thy freedom staying thee. Out of some subway scuttle, cell, aloft, a bedlamite, meaning an insane person, speeds to thy parapets, tilting there momentously. Shrill shirt ballooning, a jest falls from the speechless caravan. Down wall, meaning Wall Street, from girder into street, noon leaks. A ripped tooth of the skies acetylene. All afternoon the cloud-flown derricks turn. Thy cables breathe the North Atlantic still. And obscure as that heaven of the Jews, thy guerdon, accolade thou dost bestow of anonymity time cannot raise. No idea what that means. Vibrant reprieve and pardon thou dost show. O harp and altar of the fury fused, how could mere toil align thy choiring strings? Terrific threshold of the prophet's pledge, prayer of pariah and the lover's cry. Again the traffic lights that skim thy swift, unfractioned idiom, immaculate sigh of stars, bending thy path, condense eternity, and we have seen night lifted in thine arms. Under thy shadow by the piers I waited, only in darkness is thy shadow clear. The city's fiery parcels all undone, already snow submerges an iron year. O sleepless as the river under thee, vaulting the sea, the prairie's dreaming sod, unto us lowly as sometimes sweep, descend, and of the curved ship lend a myth to God. I had no idea what that meant, but it led me to the Brooklyn Bridge. And even now, I have a little idea of some of it, but the music of it, that this could be a medium, this was very different from Ginsberg. The music, the way of making music with words. And so I went looking in poetry for inspiration for a place that poetry could make, only in the poem. So I didn't spend a lot of time worrying about meanings. I tried to get involved in the poems I was reading. And the poems coming out of the United States at the time didn't invite that. They were very linear. So I started, as I said, looking for translations because there wasn't another Hart Crane around. He died in 1930, and there wasn't that sense of space in a poem around. And one day I came upon translations of Pablo Neruda. Now, I'd read some already, but they felt flat. They were flat on the page. They didn't feel to me I sensed something under them in the language of what the imagery was doing, but as English, the image that Pablo Neruda was using was great, but the syllabic force of the translation was usually, to my ear, flat. I don't know how else to put it. And then I came across this volume called Neruda and Vallejo. Well, I'd heard of Neruda. He'd won a Nobel Prize and everything. But I never heard of Vallejo. And this is selected poems edited by Robert Bly. And he and James Wright translated these poems I read this one. You've asked me what the lobster is weaving there with his golden feet. I reply, the ocean knows this. You say, what is the Acedia waiting for in its transparent bell? What is it waiting for? I tell you it is waiting for time, like you. You ask me, whom the macrocystis alga hugs in its arms. Study it. Study it at a certain hour in a certain sea I know. You question me about the wicked tusk of the narwhal, and I reply by describing how the sea unicorn with the harpoon in it dies. You inquire about the kingfisher's feathers, which tremble in the pure springs of the southern tides. Or you found in the cards a new question touching on the crystal architecture of the sea anemone, and you'll deal that to me now. You want to understand the electric nature of the ocean pines, the armored stalactite that breaks as it walks, the hook of the anglerfish, the music stretched out of the deep places like a thread in the water. I want to tell you, the ocean knows this, that life in its jewel boxes is endless as sand, impossible to count, pure, and among the blood-colored grapes, time has made the petal hard and shiny, made the jellyfish full of light, and untied its knot, letting its musical threads fall from a horn of plenty made of infinite mother of pearl. I am nothing but the empty net which has gone on ahead of human eyes, dead in those darknesses, of fingers accustomed to the triangle, longitudes on the timid globe of an orange. I walked around as you do, investigating the endless star, and in my net, during the night, I woke up naked, the only thing caught, a fish trapped inside the wind. And I was on a bus in Boston. I'm about 25 years old, and 26, and I went, yay! This guy is speaking. I don't know what the hell he's saying in a lot of these lines, but he's saying, you ask me this, I tell you this, go, look at the ocean. And he's excited about it. He's very excited. And I wake up out of an endless dream like a fish in the wind, and fishes aren't in the wind. And this made sense to my body. This made sense to my heart. It made me happy to read that poem. It always makes me happy to read that poem. And there was life in the language. It was jumping off the page. And I go, who is this guy, Robert Bly? Who can translate this well? Who is this guy, Robert Bly, giving such life to this poetry? And the other poet that is in the book is Neruda and Vallejo. Well, Cesar Vallejo, I may be pronouncing the words wrong, but he was a Peruvian poet. He died, I believe, in the 1940s. Bly was the first person to translate him into English. Neruda knew his poetry, and I think knew Vallejo. He was part, which great tribe did they have down there? Inca or Aztec, I think Inca. He was part, in any case, of the people who built Machu Picchu. And completely unknown outside the Spanish language. And as I said, nobody had translated him yet into English. Here it was, the early 1970s, and Vallejo was completely unknown. North of the border, our border, and Vallejo is writing things like, wait a minute, I have it here. This won't take as long as Art, right? Okay. What if, after so many words, the word itself doesn't survive? And what if, after so many wings of birds, The stopped birth doesn't survive. It would be better then, really, if we were all swallowed up, and let's end it. To have been born only to live off our own death? To raise ourselves from the heavens toward the earth, carried up by our own bad luck, always watching for a moment to put out our darkness with our shadow? It would be better, frankly, if we were all swallowed up in the hell with it. And what if after so much history we succumb, not to eternity, but to these simple things like being at home or starting to brood? What if we discover later, all of a sudden, that we are living to judge by the height of the stars off a comb and off stains on a handkerchief? It would be better, really, if we were all swallowed up right now. They'll say we have a lot of grief in one eye and a lot of grief in the other also. And when they look, a lot of grief in both. So then, naturally. So, don't say a word. And you can hear the life in these things.
Yeah.
These things are fully alive. And Bly was bringing that life into the English-American language, into American poetry. And for me, that is the biggest thing he did years before I met him. And I met him because of that. Bly's own poetry begins very quietly. I read his first book or his second book in the 60s, and I didn't like them much. For one thing, he was a Swede from the farms of Minnesota, and I'm a Wall Street kid from New York City, and his imagery wasn't real to me. But his translations jumped. I mean, they were like jazz. And he chose to translate a bunch of people. And I read every translation as it came out. Antonio Machado, Jimenez, Tomas Transtoma, Rilke, although Robert's translations of Rilke aren't my favorite. But, and then when I met him, finally, I met him also through his poetry. What happened was the Vietnam War. Well, it's hard to talk about that war now. It's been in movies and such, and it's a controversy that never died down. But what the United States did for 10 or 12 years to those little Southeast Asian countries was pretty incredible, pretty incredibly awful.
Yeah, that's part of it. That we have all these movies and TV shows about how terrible it was for our young boys, but you really don't get a lot of the millions of South Vietnamese civilians that were killed in bombings. We don't hear a lot about that, and you'd think we would, but that's a part of it that's hardly ever talked about.
Exactly, and it still needs to be.
And Cambodians and Laotians, I should say.
Exactly. And so when I think of Robert Bly as a friend or as a mentor, I think of him first always as a poet. And a poet who organized Poets Against the War when it wasn't a cool thing to do. Because Robert Bly wasn't a poet who was part of the academia. He never went into academia. He graduated from Harvard. He could have gone into academia.
Really? Huh.
Yep. But he never went into academia. He didn't want to be... He wanted to write his poems from the life as people lived it, where he was from. He kept that farm going, and he gradually became kind of a troubadour, as when you met him, giving readings and being very practiced at that, and a showman, really, as troubadours were. But it's important to remember that the poetry of the man. And he wrote a poem about the war, which I think is one of the best American poems.
Can I ask you something? Can I ask you something first?
Sure.
Were people making money writing poetry during that time?
No.
So he's making money as like a translator and such then, or how is he supporting himself in the farm? And
I think he was supporting himself with the farm.
Oh, okay, all right.
I don't know that for sure, yeah. but he ran a little press of his own called it began, I believe, in the 50s, called 50s Press, and 60s and 70s and 80s. He published these on his own little press.
Yeah.
And then a larger publisher picked up those books and published them in a larger format. He first published Vallejo, for instance, in just a little chapbook of 20 poems. And so I imagine he got money from publishers for his more well-known books of poetry, like this is Sleepers Joining Hands, which I believe won a Pulitzer Prize or something. I know somewhere along the line he won one of those, National Book Award.
But compared to today, poets were making a little bit of money. I mean, it was more of you could actually maybe make some kind of career out of being a poet, maybe.
No, we had to do something else. I don't think Robert Frost, yes.
But there was more of it. There was more of a public interest in poetry back then. There has to have been.
I think so.
Because there's zero now. Okay, so and
But that's very subjective. One of the things that's going on now is poetry has become kind of a profession. You become a poet, you publish in a university press, you have to get a master's, and you get it in teaching. And so the poets are all ghettoed on campuses.
I see, yeah.
And that had begun to happen in the 50s, and Robert didn't want any part of it. He wanted a wider life than that.
Okay, but you don't. There's like you think of this group called the Beat Poets, right? That, but since then, you don't really have, at least to my knowledge, and I'm not a big poetry guy, but you don't have like a genre that comes to the public's mind like that, right?
No, you don't.
Okay.
No, not that I know of.
Yeah.
You do have certain places where it's more welcome than others.
Yeah.
But basically, it is now an academic, in terms of it as a social force, it's an academic phenomenon.
Yeah.
And if you read an anthology of poems, and I still am reading mostly poems from other lands in translation, but it'll say teaches at X, and it could be anywhere.
Yeah.
And so almost all the American poets today are teaching somewhere.
Okay.
Almost all the American novelists today are teaching somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask.
Yeah.
let me ask you this. Besides the United States, then, are was there, or I mean, in the past 50 years, is it more highly regarded in some other countries to be a poet, and does the public have more regard for poetry, and you could be like a public name because of your poetry?
Russia
Hmm.
has always loved poetry.
Yeah.
Uh, Yevtushenko filled stadiums, or at least theaters, and became a big celebrity in the 60s. Boris Pasternak, the Russian government's afraid of its poets. Boris Pasternak smuggled Dr. Zhivago out of the manuscript out of Russia in the late 1950s. The character Zhivago is a poet. The novel is so much better than the film, but the character Zhivago is a poet, and the novel ends with about 20 poems by Yuri Zhivago. And Pasternak was a very famous poet and translator. Stalin and the others let him live. Osip Mandelstam was a wonderful poet, and he wrote one poem in the 20s in which Stalin is mocked, and read it to a few friends in a living room somewhere in St. Petersburg, which was then Leningrad. And one of the friends ratted him out, and he died in the Gulag. Marina Tsvetaeva was a marvelous poet, and she tried leaving Russia. She came back. She died committing suicide because she was penniless. Anna Akhmatova, I think, was one of the greatest poets of the century, and she wasn't allowed to. The Russian government wouldn't let her publish for over 40 years, and yet in Russia everything rhymes. So she was a rhyming poet, because you almost can't not be in Russia with Russian, and she would memorize her poems, and they would be passed from friend to friend to friend, and people found in the gulags secret little books that people had written down her poems and kept them to comfort them. In Neruda, once his poetry started getting recognized, his country was proud of him, Chile, and made him part of the ambassadors, part of the, he wasn't the ambassador to Spain, and the ambassadorial staff. During the Spanish Civil War, he came out very strongly for the Republic and against the fascists, and they didn't want him to be famous anymore. And he was actually on the run from the police. And then he wins a Nobel Prize, and everything's fine. Poland, I could tell you Polish poets, Czesław Miłosz, Wisława Szymborska. I'm murdering the pronunciation of their names, but so in other places, poetry, Octavio Paz in Mexico, who also becomes kind of an ambassador. George Seferis in Greece becomes the ambassador to England. Yanis Christos was a communist. They didn't make him an ambassador. But it is, in other cultures, poetry has been given considerably more respect than in this culture. In this culture, if somebody you say you're a poet. Mahmoud Darwish, a Palestinian, he died not too long ago. Marvelous poet.
Yeah, I was trying to rack my brain for poets living poets that I was aware of as a child or a young person, and that were in the I mean, I'd heard of many different poets, but ones that we would hear about in school or that were kind of in the public realm. And the only ones that that came to mind were Robert Frost and Shel Silverstein.
Yeah, when I was in high school, Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, and if you were really into poetry, William Carlos Williams, who supported himself as a doctor all his life. He was the most influential American poet, period. A lot of people who never read Williams write poetry like Williams, and he was a doctor, pediatrician. His whole life, his son inherited his practice, and in the world of poetry, he was very famous, but you couldn't make a living on that. You certainly couldn't support a family on it. Hart Crane tried to write advertising copy. Hated it, but tried to do it. So, let me get back to Bly.
Sure, yeah.
And it's a good question. It's a very good question. But no, I'm working on a poem I've been working on for 50 years. Do you think anybody's going to read this poem? You think I'm deluding myself? I want to finish it. I want to finish it because I want to finish it.
Well, before we get off of this train of thought, I just want to say that there was a time when you could be a kind of movie star poet, no? Like Walt Whitman, or you could even say Mark Twain. There was a very high regard for poets, at least in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Yes, there was. Now Whitman, remember, he was a typesetter when that was a profession. The typesetters were the radical unions. They're the ones who read the books, and it's hard to be an ignorant typesetter. And he typeset and sold and printed the first edition of his book himself. And it wasn't like any book of poetry that had ever been written anywhere. It doesn't even have an author's name on it until well into the poem. If you get a first edition, 1855, and it was the most radical piece of poetry in English since Shakespeare, and nobody had written a poem like that anywhere. So not just in English, and it became Whitman influenced Neruda. Whitman influenced Vladimir Mayakovsky in Russia. He was another very popular cat, and his influences. Then he influenced William Carlos Williams, who in turn influenced all these people. But Robert Frost is a great poet, don't get me wrong. I would not put down Robert Frost. He was a really great poet, and he did become popular. But he was a poet that people could think they understood.
Yeah.
That's different from being understood, but people could think they understood. And John F. Kennedy could have Robert Frost write a poem for his inauguration, but I still don't quite understand. He gets up and reads it, and it rhymes, and it's Robert Frost, and everybody goes, "Yay!" Great technician, but also a great poet. I mean, stuff that seems simple and is not.
Okay, go back to Robert Bly.
So Robert took it on himself, and this is I think, a huge thing, to write a poem about Vietnam. And he calls it The Teeth Mother, Naked at Last. Massive engines lift beautifully from the deck. Wings appear over the trees, wings with 800 rivets. Engines burning 1,000 gallons of gasoline a minute sweep over the huts with dirt floors. The chickens feel the new fear deep in the pits of their beaks. Buddha with Padma Sambhava. Meanwhile, out in the China Sea, immense gray bodies are floating, born in Roanoke, the ocean on both sides expanding, buoyed on the dense marine. Helicopters flutter overhead. The death bee is coming. Super sabers like knots of neurotic energy sweep around and return. This is Hamilton's triumph. This is the advantage of a centralized bank. B-52s come from Guam. All the teachers die in flames. The hopes of Tolstoy fall asleep in the antheap. Do not ask for mercy. Now the time comes to look into the past tunnels, the hours given and taken in school, the scuffles in coat rooms. Foam leaps from his nostrils. Now we come to the scum you take from the mouths of the dead. Now we sit beside the dying and hold their hands. There's hardly time for goodbye. The staff sergeant from North Carolina is dying. You hold his hand. He knows the mansions of the dead are empty. He has an empty place inside him, created one night when his parents came home drunk. He uses half his skin to cover it as you try to protect the balloon from sharp objects. Artillery shells explode. Napalm canisters roll end over end. 800 steel pellets fly through the vegetable walls. The 6-hour infant puts its fists instinctively to his eyes to keep out the light, but the room explodes. The children explode. Blood leaps on the vegetable walls. Yes, I know, blood leaps on the walls. Don't cry at that. Do you cry at the wind pouring out of Canada? Do you cry at the reeds shaking at the edge of the sloughs? The Marine Battalion enters. This happens when the seasons change. This happens when the leaves begin to drop from the trees too early. Kill them. I don't want to see anything moving. This happens when the ice begins to show its teeth in the ponds. This happens when the heavy layers of lake water press down on the fish's head and send him deeper, where his tail swirls slowly and his brain passes him pictures of heavy reeds, of vegetations falling on vegetation. Hamilton saw all of this in detail. Every banana tree slashed, every cooking utensil smashed, every mattress cut. The marine knives sweep around the sharp-edged jets. How beautifully they slash open the rice bags, the mattresses. Ducks are killed with $150 shotguns. Old women watch soldiers as they move. The ministers lie. The professors lie. The television lies. The priests lie. These lies means that the country wants to die. Lie after lie starts out into the prairie grass like enormous caravans of Conestoga wagons, and a long desire for death flows out, guiding the enormous caravans from beneath, stringing together the vague and foolish words. It is a desire to eat death, to gobble it down, to rush on it like a cobra with mouth open. It's a desire to take death inside, to feel it burning inside, pushing out velvety hairs like a clothes brush in the intestines. This is the thrill that leads the president on to lie. This is what it's like to have a gross national product. It's because the aluminum window shade business is doing so well in the United States that we roll fire over entire villages. It's because a hospital room in the average American city now costs $90 a day that we bomb hospitals in the north. It's because the milk trains coming into New Jersey hit the right switches every day that the best Vietnamese men are cut into by American bullets that follow each other like freight cars. This is what it's like to send firebombs down from air-conditioned cockpits. This is what it's like to hold to fire into a reed hut with an automatic weapon. This is what it's like to be told to fire into a reed hut with an automatic weapon. It's because taxpayers move to the suburbs that we transfer populations. The Marines use cigarette lighters to light the factories and huts because so many Americans own their own homes. I know that books are tired of us. I know that they are chaining the Bible to chairs. Books don't want to remain in the same room with us anymore. New Testaments are escaping, dressed as women. They go off after dark. And Plato wants to go backwards. He wants to hurry back up the river of time so he can end as some blob of sea flesh rotting on an Australian beach. But if one of those children came near that we have set on fire, came towards you like a gray barn walking, you would howl like a wind tunnel in a hurricane. You would tear at your shirt with blue hands. You would drive over your own children's wagon trying to back up. The pupils of your eyes would go wild. If a child came by burning, you would dance on a lawn, trying to leap into the air, digging into your cheeks. You would ram your head against the wall of your bedroom like a bullpen too long in his moody pen. If one of those children came toward me with both hands in the air, fire rising along both elbows, I would suddenly go back to my animal brain. I would drop on all fours screaming. My vocal cords would turn blue. So would yours. It would be 2 days before I could play with my own children again. Those are all parts of that poem. And you can see where Neruda and Vallejo taught Robert Bly what they taught Robert Bly so that he could write a poem like that.
Yeah.
And that's not the nice, jolly guy, the big guy with white hair, people who, you know, the movie star Robert Bly. That's not the movie star
Right.
Robert Bly.
Yeah.
That's somebody, you know, giving everything he has to try to tell it like it.
What year is
That's
that?
Robert Bly. He wrote this in the early 70s. It was published as a chapbook by City Lights, and then published again. This is copyright 1973. And the war is still going on by 1973. And going on for 10 years. It was going on longer than that, but we didn't know it.
Well, why don't we? Are you comfortable ending there for today, and then we'll do? We'll get more into his activism and public life next time.
Yeah, that's a good place to end.
Okay.